In the beginning, God created heaven and earth and made everything that was made. Since that beginning, the earth has been in progressive stages of change and development. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Customs and ways of life have changed and changed again. Centers of culture and learning have moved about the earth from century to century as men have sought new answers to old questions. Into this panorama of change moved the New World, America, the land of the free. And across the centuries following, the New World and a new way of life have initiated amazing and unique developments. But you cannot reckon developments without accounting for the part man has played. Our world is a world of man and reflects man's thinking, capabilities, and characters.
Do you really believe that, Murray?
Of course I do.
The part about this being man's world and reflecting man's thinking?
Well, of course, the term man includes women, too, but let's take a case for examination. Now, we always start these discussions from where we are, don't we?
Yes.
Look out over the panorama of your father's farm. Someday, you will inherit that land. It will be yours. Do you think you'll farm it or sell it?
I don't know, Murray. I don't think I have the love of the land that you and Father have. Depends a little on marriage, I suppose.
I'd like to see you stay on the land, Ruth. As you say, your father and I love the land. But love and struggle for land are a major part of the history of mankind. The origin of farming is not exactly known. Across the centuries, the major activity of nations has been farming. The face of the world has changed under the steady progress of mankind. There has been tyranny and there has been escape. There has been progress and there has been stagnation. But land arrangements have held a front position since the earliest days of man. There are always those who are seeking a change, always those who are seeking a place in the sun. Land has consistently represented stature in our civilized world. And the discovery of America afforded opportunities unlimited for new lands and new freedoms.
Let me see if I understand what you're saying. The idea is that the new land of America offered new frontiers in which people could seek out new lives, have land of their own, be free from certain burdens which they had felt in the old world.
Exactly. Now let's bring your imagination into play and see if we can picture just what this new world was like. You've seen maps of the United States. Well, that portion of North America has always looked the same. Of course, it hasn't always been divided up into states the way we're used to seeing it. But the geographical outlines were forever the same. In 1790, the frontier of America wasn't very imposing. The vast majority of the land was unsettled. Of course, trappers and explorers and missionaries were constantly pushing out into the wilderness. But the settlement frontier looked relatively small in 1790.
But even this frontier represented considerable westward expansion in the 300 years from the discovery of America.
You're exactly right. Of course, 300 years earlier, there was no settlement, and getting a foothold in the New World was extremely difficult. The earliest settlers had to cut their farms and communities out of the woods. It was hard work and took many months to clear sizable portions of land so they would be suitable for farming. And of course, this was a situation that always existed on the frontiers as settlers spread out across the face of the continent. The pioneer was always striking out westward for new lands, and when he found his spot, either by choice or because he was physically unable to go any farther, he would begin to clear land and settle down to provide for his family. As the settler was pushed westward, communities would spring up as the need for them arose. These communities would provide churches, schools, and stores for the settlers. By the time the frontier had pushed to where it was in 1790, we had fought the Revolutionary War, and what is now the northern border of the United States was established by treaty.
But there were some people who stayed put and built up cities and towns, weren't there?
There were, to be sure. Cities and towns were building up. But one reason for the westward movement was a great influx of population, and people were pushing farther and farther west to find the promised land they were seeking. They were spurred onward for many reasons. Some found what they were seeking. Some were disappointed. But behind it all, in New England and through the South, there was an American culture growing, a culture based on an agricultural economy. George Washington was a landowner in Virginia and grew tobacco and other crops. And the husking bee was one example of recreational activities, usually centering about useful work. Oh yes, behind the frontiers we were building active communities, which were the backbone of America. And, of course, we were establishing a government, the seat of which was at that time in Philadelphia.
If we were living in an agricultural economy, this new government of which you speak must have been beset with agricultural problems.
It was faced with problems. And, of course, its earliest problems centered about distribution of these vast land holdings. As evidence of how they faced up to their problems, let's witness this statement.
An ordinance for ascertaining the mode of disposing of lands in the Western Territory, May 20th, 1785. Be it ordained by the United States and Congress assembled that the territory ceded by individual states to the United States shall be disposed of in the following manner. A surveyor from each state appointed by Congress shall proceed to divide the said territories into townships. The townships shall be marked by subdivisions into lots of 1 mile square, or 640 acres. The commissioners of the loan office of the several states shall proceed to sell the townships or fractional parts of townships at public auction, provided that none of the funds within the said territory be sold under the price of $1 the acre.
Then this 1 square mile of 640 acres is what we call a section today.
That's right. But to pinpoint some of the issues of these times, let's ask a few questions of this contemporary of the period. Pardon me, sir.
Yes?
You were just going over parts of the Ordinance of 1785 there.
Yes, I was.
Could you tell me just what the issues are?
Well, actually, the issues are quite clear. The principal ones are these. Shall the land be sold in small parcels to actual settlers, or perhaps even given away? Or shall individuals or companies be allowed to come between the government and the settler? That is, buy up large areas for speculation. Now, if the land is sold, then the issue is whether the price shall be all that traffic will bear, or a mere nominal payment. There are also problems of whether or not we should extend credit, and if so, how much.
Would you care to state your position in this controversy?
I'm afraid not, sir. At this time, I am simply acting in the capacity of a reporter.
While legislative and policy decisions were being debated between the liberals and the conservatives, the American frontier moves steadily westward. 1800, 1810, 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, a great mass of settlers moving steadily westward.
But I'm interested in the outcome of this conflict between the liberals and the conservatives.
All right, let's trace some of its historical past. But first, I'd like to create in you a feeling of sympathy for the problem.
I'm willing to be sympathetic.
Well, how's that imagination doing?
Fine.
All right, let's bring it back into play. Imagine for a moment that you're a settler. You have a log cabin out on the frontier. Your husband works hard out on the land all day, and you work hard to prepare a home and meals for him, and even help him outside when he needs the help, and you're able. Do you get the picture?
I'm doing pretty well so far.
Now, the only land you have is what your husband has cleared. This was all woodland when you first moved there. And in the many months you have lived there, your husband has girdled the trees and let them die, then cut them down and burned them, burned out the stumps and tried to clear the land as best he could. You were lucky. Your husband had hired out in the seacoast towns and was able to save enough money to buy this section. $640 at the time he bought it was an immense amount of cash, and the terms were cash, or practically so. Why, there were many frontiersmen who perhaps didn't see as much as $5 cash in a year. You've been there 2 years. If you're lucky and all goes well, you may be able to grow an income-producing crop next year. What if you hadn't had that money to buy the land? Do you see the problem?
Well, as I see it, it's smaller payments, smaller segments of land, the abolishment of land speculation, pretty much as the man said a few minutes ago.
How does it feel to be a pioneer woman?
Well, I don't see any calluses on my hands. I don't think I've worked up any extra muscle, but your object lesson was well taken. But did these hardships result in undue difficulties to the westward movement?
Well, not that anyone could notice, I suppose. Some settlers did go out ahead of the land surveys and settle on land that was not available for purchase. Some called them squatters and spoke of squatters' rights. But the issue was officially known as preemption, and there was considerable discussion about preemption rights.
What was the outcome of this issue?
Well, Ruth, when I think of preemption, I think of my old history teacher, because I think he put it a little better than a lot of people could.
The settlers of the West, pushing ahead faster than the government land surveyors, created a problem of grave character. Individual settlers squatted on public land and considered it grossly unfair when land they had cleared, cultivated, and improved were put up for public sale according to established laws. Congress in 1841 recognizing the rights of squatters and the force of public opinion enacted a preemption law by which settlers could settle on a quarter section of unsurveyed public land with the right of purchase at the minimum price when such land was placed on sale.
Mr. Bannington.
Yes.
Would you describe the outcome of the differences between the conservative and liberal factions on the question of land policy?
Well, I would say that recorded history shows a steady liberalization of policy between the end of the Revolutionary period in 1862. The first major actions of the Congress of Confederation were to lay down the basic principles of land distribution, and these principles have been adhered to since their enactment in 1785. It became increasingly clear, however, that no one plan of administration would well please everyone. But as our country expanded, more and more territories began to send representatives to our national government. Now, these representatives presented a constant influence to liberalize the land policies of the West. The smallest amounts purchasable were in 1795, 640 acres. In 1820, 80 acres. And in 1832, only 40 acres. The triumph of the advocates of liberal land policy came in 1862 when the Homestead Act was the logical culmination of the long struggle for free access to the public domain by pioneer farmers. This act provided for a grant of full title for 160 acres to the actual settler after 5 years of residence.
Thank you, sir. You've been very helpful. Now, to get back to the problem of our frontier. In 1850, our pioneers stood on the edge of the great prairies. At first, these frontiersmen thought that land which would not grow trees would not grow crops. And there were problems of plowing the heavy prairie sod and of working the soil into a plantable condition. But American ingenuity was sufficient for this task. Heavier steel plows were developed, and the pioneer found the rich prairie soil truly a new frontier in agriculture. Wagon trains pushed westward across the prairie. There were many hazards along the way. Hostile Indians and sicknesses delayed or halted permanently many wagon trains across the prairies. Living on the prairie was quite different from living in areas where timber was available. And here, if we can resort to a little imagination again, if you're willing.
Of course I'm willing.
All right, now let's send that imagination out to the west of a few years back. It was not uncommon to see abandoned sod huts, such as you're standing in front of there now.
You mean people actually lived in places like this?
And there was nothing else to build houses from, so they built them out of the sod. You can see that they cut up the prairie sod in sizes like large bricks or stone and stacked them up to make their walls. Their roofs were often made of sod, too. It was an exercise in ingenuity for the pioneer, but he proved himself quite sufficient for the task. This was not the only field in which his ingenuity was called to task. And so the course of the empire was steadily westward. 1860, 1870, 1880, and 1890. The picture was broadening. Trading posts and agencies were forming the nucleus of communities. The railroads began to enter the picture. Now pioneer families could go farther west faster than by wagon. With the opening of the Cherokee Strip, for instance, trains were loaded to capacity with people wanting to take advantage of the new lands. Of course, the trains didn't even begin to take care of the people who were waiting at the border of the Cherokee Strip for the opening gun to be fired so they could race forward to make their claims on this new land. There was much talk of manifest destiny, that it was the destiny of America to settle their land from coast to coast. There was much hope and much hardship. The story of the westward movement is the story of a courageous people, each looking for something which he deemed valuable. There were new horizons to be reached, greener fields to be sought. The railroads pressed across the continent to provide easier transportation. Hard-working, ambitious settlers were flanked by profiteers, prospectors, and speculators. It was a turbulent world, this ever-moving frontier, but behind the pioneer came the forces for the establishment of solid communities. There were schools to be built, railroads to be built, communication lines to be strung. The last half of the 19th century was marked by wretched housing and poor living throughout most of the frontier areas. Roads were poor and frequently impassable in wet weather. Schools were primitive and facilities for social life inadequate. Clothing and furniture were of the roughest kind. Improvement was moving along a few years behind the frontier, but moving westward just the same. Behind this frontier, there was the solidly developing agricultural economy of the United States. Farms, very much as we see them today, except for the mechanization. Successful farming carried with it all the prestige that the settlers had early hoped that it would. Farm products then, as now, varied with the area. Cotton in the South, where the slave labor was plentiful before the Civil War, and where labor continued to be cheap even after the freedom of the slave. Cattle raising flourished through many areas of the West and the Southwest. The prairie lands were found to be exceptionally suitable for the raising of fine grain crops, such as wheat, and of course, the corn belt of the nation. These patterns were established early and have remained substantially unchanged. Near the close of the 19th century, land policy was firmly established on the basis of private ownership. Full and rapid settlement of land suited to crops, and in general, the family-sized farm granted either without charge or at a nominal price. The Homestead Act provided for free land if the family would settle and establish a home. The land policy contained no element of restriction on regrouping into larger units, and this regrouping occurred extensively in some areas. Huge commercial farms sprang up here and there, farms which might be classified as big business with many employees. But, by and large, this country has remained the land of the family-sized farm, just as Thomas Jefferson had pictured it in the early days of our nation. So that today, when an American farmer stands proudly on the hillside and surveys his land, he is viewing property which has increased steadily in value since it was first settled. He owns one of the almost 5.5 million farms which were in operation in 1950, almost 5 times as many farms as there were 100 years earlier.
Well, you've certainly brought me up to date on agricultural development in a hurry. But I suppose all these lands available for homesteading are gone by now.
Well, actually, back at the turn of the century, Ruth, we began to realize that our good lands were gone. And we also began to realize that our natural resources were going rapidly, too. And here would be a good place to give you a little object lesson again, I think. Look around you now.
Why, it seems to be heavy forest as far as I can see on every side. What is this, a national forest or something?
In the early days of this country, there was forest land, a heavy stand of timber solidly across the northern section of our continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. Our early settlers, even our early lawmakers, operated on the theory that there was an abundant, even an inexhaustible source of land and natural resources. Neither legislation nor custom had as yet placed any restraint on destruction or exploitation of farmlands, forests, or mineral resources. A new attitude with respect to conservation and natural resources was beginning to take shape, but it made little progress until the turn of the century, 1900. By 1900, the best of the forests of the lake states had been cut over, and it began to be apparent that the shortage was likely to become more serious as time went on, since timber cutting was outrunning new growth. Theodore Roosevelt became the champion of our natural resources and immediately launched on the program of conservation of natural resources, the protection of navigable waters and streams, the control of forest fires, government regulation of cutting of timber, retention by government of underground mineral rights, and so on. The early land legislation, including the Homestead Act, related almost entirely to land watered by natural rainfall. When the dry regions further west began to be taken up by farmers, it soon became evident that the settlement plans designed for the humid areas were poorly suited to the dry lands of the west. Where irrigation was not to be undertaken, the quarter sections provided under the regular Homestead Act were far too small to provide to support families. Where the land was to be irrigated through large-scale projects, a 160-acre farm was likely to impose an outlay larger than the settler could undertake, and if used for intensive agriculture, to require more manpower than the farmer and his family could supply. Thus, the traditional 160-acre homestead plan was poorly adapted for either dry land farming or irrigated agriculture. When the settlement of arid regions was first begun, small irrigation systems were developed by individual farmers who took water from streams adjoining or running through their properties. Individual farm irrigating systems were common in some sections, but the amount of land that could be irrigated through these rudimentary arrangements was limited and in no sense adequate to meet the growing demand. With the passage of enabling acts in various states, group projects for building of dams and canals and distribution of water became common. Most of these were organized as irrigation districts, with many of the powers and characteristics of minor civil divisions of government.
This Reclamation Act was responsible for the building of many large dams, wasn't it?
Yes, there were many such projects developed, many of them during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. But the need for another type of conservation was also becoming apparent. Soil depletion was apparent in parts of the United States from colonial times onward. But so long as rich new lands were available further west, this did not occasion serious public concern. The wasteful depletion of forest resources was much more dramatic and also gave rise to objections on both sentimental and aesthetic grounds. Furthermore, the heavy drain on high-quality, readily accessible sources of raw timber was resulting in rapid increases in the price of lumber. The loss of soil resources was much more subtle, and only the far-sighted conservationists were deeply concerned about it until well into the present century. Woodrow Wilson was aware of the problem, and it is clear from his messages that he contemplated vigorous steps looking to the preservation of soil resources. But other matters absorbed his attention, and interest in conservation lagged considerably. But soil erosion and soil losses continued to merit the attention of the various experts, and the disastrous droughts and dust storms which came in the 30s served to place the conservation of soils high on the list of major objectives in national agricultural policy. The government, in 1935, came out with this summary statement.
The soil erosion specialists tell us that the dust storm of May 11, 1934, swept 300 million tons of fertile topsoil off the Great Wheat Plains, that 400 million tons of soil material are washed annually into the Gulf of Mexico by the Mississippi River, that generally water and wind erosion together each year remove beyond use 3 billion tons of soil. All this belonging to the best farmland of the United States. This is a loss of assets that cannot be recovered, for it takes nature centuries to make the equivalent of the topsoil that has been swept away at the rate in some places of 3 to 6 inches in a single season.
From what I've heard of the Dust Bowl, it must have been a terrible thing.
It was. And of course, as that statement pointed out, the damage cannot be repaired.
Well, what was done?
Well, although the conservation movement dates back from just before the turn of the century, it is still a pretty lively topic in farm policy discussions. But there have been large-scale efforts to conserve and build up soils, an important feature of the American farm policy in the 30s. And, of course, they continue to occupy a prominent place, both in farmer attitude and national interest. Government interest in soil conservation was evidenced by the initiation of the Soil Erosion Service and its successor, the Soil Conservation Service, and by various acts intended to help the farmer set up local, county, and state advisory and administrative committees and make payments for conservation practices. Such practices as contour plowing and other erosion control methods were developed and advocated by the Land Grant College Extension Services and government agencies. The soil conservation district approach has gained steadily in public acceptance and seems destined to become a permanent feature of American agriculture. It is evident, however, that a final conclusion on methods to be used in fostering conservation has not yet been reached.
Let me see if I can sum up what we've been talking about. At first, our country's problem was how best to distribute the land it owned. And increasingly liberal policies finally resulted in the Homestead Act, which gave free land to people who settled on it. But soon our land was gone, or almost gone. We began to realize that even with the vastness of America, the unrestricted activities of millions of people would fast deplete our natural resources. And lack of proper care of land was causing it to wash or blow away in alarming amounts. And so our land policy was divided into two parts. First, how best to distribute the land among the people, and then how best to conserve it in order that it might last for the centuries to come.
Well, I think you've summed it up pretty well. But of course, you must realize that just the gaining and the conserving of land was not the sum total of the farmer's problems. He had money problems, crop problems, and social problems. Just as he had carved his way into the wilderness, he then had to carve his place in society. We'll go on with this discussion at a later date, if you're really interested.
Of course I'm interested. For one thing, it's history which is vital. And for another, I see that whether I make personal use of this farm or not, my future will always be influenced by the farmer and his economic situation. And since I am interested, could you suggest some source book that I might get in order that we might have a little more lively discussion next time?
Of course. There are many good books on the subject. For example, the 20th Century Fund has published one on farm policies of the United States from 1790 to 1950 by Murray R. Beneke, which is good. As a matter of fact, I've quoted from it today.
Fine, I'll bone up and we'll really have a discussion next time. Bye. See you later.